The bitter wind cut through Emily's wool coat like a blade as she stumbled through the knee-deep snow, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. Blood from the gash on her forehead had frozen into crystalline streaks down her cheek, and her hands, numb despite her gloves, clutched the leather satchel that had cost her everything. Behind her, somewhere in the white wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains, the men her stepfather had hired were still hunting. She could hear their voices carried on the wind, growing closer with each passing minute. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had been running for 3 days now, surviving on melted snow and the handful of dried berries she'd managed to gather before the storm hit. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and more than once she'd caught herself stumbling toward what she knew would be a fatal fall into the ravines that scarred this remote corner of upstate New York. But she pressed on, driven by a fury that burned hotter than any fire she'd ever known. They had tried to silence her, tried to bury the truth about what her stepfather's mining company had done to the sacred lands of the Mohawk nation. They had killed her mentor, destroyed her research, and now they wanted her dead too. The satchel bounced against her hip with each desperate step, its contents representing years of careful investigation into the illegal mining operations that had poisoned 3 watersheds and displaced dozens of families. Environmental lawyer or not, she was just one woman against a corporation with unlimited resources and no conscience. But she had the evidence, and as long as she drew breath, she would find a way to expose them. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought it was just another fallen log, dark against the pristine snow. But as she drew closer, her heart nearly stopped. A man lay motionless in a small clearing, his long black hair spread like spilled ink across the white ground. Blood had pooled beneath him, already beginning to freeze, and his breathing came in shallow, barely visible puffs. He wore traditional clothing beneath a modern winter jacket, and even from a distance she could see the intricate beadwork that marked him as Mohawk. Emily dropped to her knees beside him, her own desperate situation momentarily forgotten. His eyes fluttered open as she checked for a pulse, revealing depths that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom despite his obvious youth. He couldn't have been much older than her own 28 years, but something in his gaze spoke of knowledge that went far beyond book learning. "Please," she whispered, pulling off her scarf to press against the worst of his wounds. "Hold on, I'll get help, somehow." His hand, surprisingly strong despite his condition, caught her wrist. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than breath against the wind, but his words changed everything. "The emeralds," he whispered, his eyes never leaving hers. "Hidden in the sacred cave where my ancestors, where they kept the old treasures. Safe from the colonizers, behind the waterfall that freezes in winter 3 miles north of the old treaty stone. The green fire that could buy back everything they've stolen." Emily stared at the stranger, her mind racing. Emeralds in upstate New York? It seemed impossible, but the intensity in his dying eyes suggested something far beyond. Delirium. She had spent enough time researching the history of this region to know that the Mohawk had indeed hidden treasures from European colonizers. But gems of that magnitude had always been considered legend. "Who are you?" she asked, but his eyes had already closed again, his breathing becoming even more labored. She found herself trapped between impossible choices. Her pursuers were getting closer. She could hear them calling to each other through the trees, their voices carrying promises of violence that made her blood run cold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But she couldn't leave this man to die alone in the snow, and something about his words had awakened a desperate hope she hadn't dared feel in months. The story that had brought her to this frozen hell had begun 6 months earlier in her cramped office in Albany, where she'd worked as an environmental attorney for the Iroquois Legal Defense Fund. Her life then had been predictable, safe, and utterly controlled by the expectations of others. Her stepfather, Richard Blackwood, owned one of the largest mining consortiums in the Northeast, and he had made it clear from the day he married her mother that Emily was expected to use her legal training to serve his interests, not oppose them. For years, she had managed to walk the tightrope between family loyalty and her own convictions, taking cases that didn't directly conflict with Blackwood Industries while quietly funneling information to environmental groups. It wasn't heroic, but it had allowed her to sleep at night while maintaining the facade of dutiful stepdaughter that kept peace in her fractured family. Everything changed when she met Dr. Joseph Clearwater, a Mohawk environmental scientist who had dedicated his life to documenting the damage being done to traditional tribal lands. Joseph had approached her with evidence of illegal mining operations that Blackwood Industries was conducting in areas protected by federal treaty. But what made his case different was the scope of the environmental destruction they had uncovered. 3 major watersheds had been contaminated with heavy metals and mining chemicals, affecting not just the immediate area, but communities hundreds of miles downstream. Dozens of families had been forced to relocate when their well water became undrinkable, and several children had developed respiratory illnesses that doctors directly linked to airborne particulates from the mining operations. But it wasn't just the environmental impact that made Joseph's evidence so damning. He had also uncovered a paper trail showing that Blackwood Industries had systematically bribed local officials, falsified environmental impact reports, and used intimidation tactics against tribal leaders who opposed their expansion into protected areas. It was the kind of case that could destroy the company entirely and send Richard Blackwood to federal prison for decades. Emily had known from the moment. Joseph spread the documents across her desk that taking the case would end her relationship with her family forever. Richard would see her actions as the ultimate betrayal, and her mother, already fragile from years of prescription drug dependency, would likely side with her husband over her daughter. But as she read through page after page of evidence documenting deliberate poisoning of sacred lands and the systematic oppression of people who had already lost so much to colonization, she realized she couldn't live with herself if she walked away. The decision to represent Joseph and the affected tribal communities against Blackwood Industries had felt like stepping off a cliff into free fall. For the first time in her adult life, she was choosing her own path rather than following the one laid out by family expectations and social pressure. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but she had never felt more alive than in those first weeks of building their case. Joseph had become more than just a client during the months they worked together. He was brilliant, passionate about his people's welfare, and possessed a quiet strength that reminded Emily of what she had always wanted to be. He never pressured her to move faster than she was comfortable with, never made her feel guilty for the years she had spent in comfortable compromise, but his presence in her life made her realize how much of herself she had been sacrificing to maintain relationships that were built on her willingness to disappear. Their growing partnership had been professional at first, long hours spent reviewing documents and interviewing witnesses, but gradually it had deepened into something more personal. Joseph had a way of listening that made Emily feel heard for the first time in years, and his stories about Mohawk traditions and history opened up a world of spiritual connection to the land that she had never experienced growing up in her stepfather's sterile corporate environment. She had been falling in love, she realized now, as she knelt beside the dying stranger in the snow, not just with Joseph, but with the possibility of a life lived according to her own values rather than others' expectations. For the first time, she had been building something that belonged entirely to her, something that reflected who she actually was, rather than who she was supposed to be. Then, Richard had discovered what she was doing. The confrontation had been swift and brutal. Richard had summoned her to his office on a Friday afternoon, ostensibly for their usual monthly lunch, but the moment she walked through the door, she knew something had changed. The documents from her case against Blackwood Industries were spread across his mahogany desk like an accusation, and his face held the cold fury she remembered from her teenage years whenever she had dared to question his authority. "You ungrateful little bitch," he had said without preamble, his voice quiet in the way that had always terrified her more than shouting. "After everything I've given you, everything I've done for your mother, this is how you repay me. By destroying everything I've built." Emily had tried to explain, tried to make him understand that she was fighting for something larger than corporate profits, but Richard had been beyond reason. He had given her an ultimatum: drop the case, destroy all evidence, and publicly denounce Joseph and his environmental claims, or face the complete destruction of everything she cared about. "You think you're some kind of crusader," he had continued, standing to pace behind his desk like a predator circling wounded prey. "But you're nothing without the opportunities I've provided. Your law degree, your connections, your reputation, all of it comes from me, and what I've given I can take away." The threats had escalated quickly. Richard would have her disbarred for ethics violations he would manufacture. He would use his political connections to have Joseph arrested on fabricated charges. He would cut off financial support for her mother's medical care and ensure that Emily never found work with another environmental organization. Most chillingly, he had made it clear that the evidence against his company would disappear one way or another, along with anyone who might try to use it. Emily had walked out of that office knowing that her old life was over, but she had underestimated both Richard's resources and his willingness to use violence to protect his interests. Within a week, Joseph had been found dead in what police called a hiking accident. His body discovered at the bottom of a ravine with no witnesses and no investigation beyond the cursory examination required for accidental death. All of their research, everything they had collected to build their case, had vanished from Joseph's office and Emily's apartment while she was attending his funeral. But Emily had been paranoid enough, or perhaps intuitive enough, to keep one complete set of documents in a safety deposit box that Richard didn't know about. The satchel she now carried contained photocopies of everything: the environmental reports, the bribery documentation, the medical records linking mining operations to childhood illnesses, and most importantly, Joseph's own research into the historical and cultural significance of the lands being destroyed. She'd been trying to reach the Canadian border when Richard's men had finally tracked her down. Her plan had been simple: get the evidence to a journalist she trusted in Toronto, someone with enough independence and international reach to publish the story, despite any pressure Richard might bring to bear. But the men hunting her had proven more persistent and better equipped than she had anticipated, and now she was trapped in a wilderness that could kill her as surely as any human enemy. The wounded man stirred again, drawing her attention back onto the immediate crisis. His eyes opened with visible effort, and when he looked at her, she saw recognition that seemed impossible given their circumstances. "You're Emily Blackwood," he said, his voice stronger than before but still barely audible above the wind. "Joseph told me about you, said you were the one white lawyer who might actually give a damn about justice." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You knew Joseph? How?" "Michael Two Feathers," he managed, attempting what might have been a smile. "Joseph was my cousin. He said if anything happened to him, I should find you, help you finish what he started." Emily felt tears freeze on her cheeks as the implications sank in. Joseph had been planning for his own death, had tried to create a backup plan to ensure Their work would continue, even if Richard succeeded in silencing him. The thought that he had died expecting violence, preparing for it, made her grief and rage burn even hotter. "The emeralds," she said urgently, glancing over her shoulder at the sound of voices that seemed closer now. "Are they real? Could they actually make a difference?" Michael's hand tightened on her wrist with surprising strength. "Sacred stones hidden by my great-great-grandfather when the cavalry came to drive us from these mountains. Enough green. Fire to buy back half the land they've stolen, enough to fund legal battles for generations." His breathing was becoming more labored, but his eyes held a fierce determination. "Joseph believed you were the one who could use them right, who wouldn't just sell them for personal gain." The sound of breaking branches announced that her pursuers were very close now. Emily could hear their voices clearly, harsh men discussing how to dispose of her body once they recovered the documents. She had minutes at most before they found this clearing, and then both she and Michael would die in the snow with their secrets. "Where exactly?" she whispered desperately. "How do I find this cave?" Michael's directions were precise, despite his condition, spoken with the clarity of someone who had walked these mountains since childhood. The waterfall he described was part of local Mohawk legend, a place where spirits were said to guard the treasures of the ancestors. In winter, when the water froze, the cave behind it became accessible to those who knew how to climb the ice formations safely. 3 miles north, he repeated, his voice fading but his eyes still locked on hers. "Past the treaty stone, where my people signed away our birthright. The cave entrance is behind the ice, but you have to know the old songs. To open the inner chamber. Joseph taught me you were learning our language, learning our ways." Emily had indeed been studying Mohawk traditions as part of their legal case, trying to understand the spiritual and cultural significance of the lands being destroyed. Joseph had been teaching her not just the language, but the deeper connections between his people and the natural world, the responsibilities that came with taking something from the earth, and the ceremonies required to maintain balance. "Sing the Thanksgiving song for the 3 sisters," Michael whispered, his words becoming urgent as the voices of their pursuers grew louder. "Corn, beans, squash. Thank them for sustaining life. Ask permission to take what you need to protect life. The ancestors will hear your intention, will judge if you're worthy of their trust." Before Emily could ask more questions, Michael pressed something into her palm. It was a small stone pendant, carved with symbols she recognized from Joseph's teachings. The surface was smooth from generations of handling, and even through her gloves she could feel an unusual warmth radiating from it. "Proof of lineage," he breathed. "So they know Joseph sent you, so they know you carry his purpose." The crashing of underbrush announced that their time was up. Emily could see flashlight beams cutting through the trees, hear the harsh voices of men who had been paid well to ensure her silence. She looked down at Michael, torn between the impulse to stay and fight for his life and the knowledge that running was their only chance of completing what Joseph had died for. "Go," Michael said, reading her thoughts. "They'll waste time with me. Give you a head start. Make his death mean something." Emily squeezed his hand once, then forced herself to stand and plunge deeper into the wilderness. Behind her, she heard shouts as Richard's men discovered Michael's body, heard them argue about whether to pursue her immediately or call for reinforcements. The delay he was buying her with his life might be the difference between success and failure, between justice and the complete victory of corporate greed over human decency. As she ran through the snow, following Michael's directions toward a destination that might be nothing more than legend, Emily realized that everything about her existence had changed in the space of a few desperate minutes. The frightened woman, who had fled Albany 3 days ago, had been running away from something. Now she was running towards something far more dangerous, but infinitely more important than her own survival. The emeralds, if they existed, represented more than just a source of funding for legal battles against Blackwood Industries. They were a symbol of everything that had been stolen from the Mohawk people, everything that corporate colonization continued to take from indigenous communities across the country. If she could find them, if she could use them as Joseph and Michael had intended, she might be able to turn the tide in a war that had been raging for centuries. But first, she had to survive the next few hours, had to reach the waterfall and find a cave that might exist only in stories told by tribal elders. She had to trust in traditions she barely understood, had to believe that the ancestors Michael spoke of would recognize her intention and grant her access to treasures that had been hidden for generations. As the wind howled through the trees, and the voices of her pursuers faded behind her, Emily clutched the stone pendant Michael had given her and pressed forward into the unknown. For the first time in her life, she was completely alone, completely responsible for her own choices, completely free to become whoever she had the courage to be. The old Emily Blackwood, the dutiful stepdaughter who had spent her life avoiding conflict and seeking approval, was dying in the snow behind her. What emerged from this wilderness would be something entirely new, something forged in the crucible of loss and desperation, and the terrible responsibility of carrying forward the dreams of the dead. The frozen landscape stretched endlessly before Emily, as she stumbled through the deepening snow, Michael's directions echoing in her mind like a prayer she desperately hoped someone would answer. 3 miles north of the Treaty Stone, behind a waterfall that turned to ice in winter. The words seemed simple enough, but in this wilderness, where every tree looked identical and the storm had erased most landmarks, finding her destination felt like searching for a single snowflake in a blizzard. Her legs burned with the effort of pushing through snow that sometimes reached her thighs, and the wound on her forehead had begun bleeding again, leaving a trail of crimson drops that she prayed her pursuers wouldn't notice. The leather satchel containing Joseph's evidence felt heavier with each step, its weight a constant reminder of everything that depended on her reaching the cave Michael had described. The voices behind her had faded, but Emily knew better than to assume she was safe. Richard's men were professionals, the kind of private security contractors who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. They would be methodical in their search, using GPS units and thermal imaging equipment that made her chances of long-term evasion virtually impossible. Her only hope lay in reaching the emerald cache before they caught up, in finding something valuable enough to force a negotiation rather than simply becoming another hiking accident statistic. As she crested a small ridge, Emily finally spotted what she had been desperately searching for. The Treaty Stone stood alone in a clearing. Below, a massive granite boulder that bore carved symbols from both Mohawk tradition and colonial-era English. She had read about this monument in Joseph's research, had seen photographs of the ceremonies held here when tribal leaders had signed away vast tracts of ancestral land in exchange for promises that were broken almost immediately. The stone was larger than she had expected, easily 10 feet tall and covered with intricate carvings that told the story of first contact between two worlds. On one side, flowing lines depicted the natural harmony the Mohawk had maintained with the land for centuries. On the other, rigid geometric patterns showed the European desire to divide, measure, and own everything they encountered. Between them, a series of handprints in both styles marked the moment when her ancestors had claimed ownership of everything Michael's ancestors held sacred. Standing beside the monument, Emily felt the full weight of the historical irony in her situation. She was a descendant of the colonizers, raised in privilege, built on stolen land, now seeking treasure hidden by the very people her family had helped to dispossess. The pendant Michael had given her seemed to burn against her palm through her gloves, as if the ancestors he had spoken of were already judging her worthiness to access their sacred cache. The storm was intensifying, and Emily knew she had to keep moving despite her exhaustion. North of the treaty stone, Michael had said, toward the waterfall where spirits guarded the old treasures. She struck out across the clearing, following what she hoped was the right direction, while the wind howled around her like the voices of the dispossessed. The landscape began to change as she climbed higher into the mountains. The relatively open forest gave way to rocky terrain cut by deep ravines and scattered with massive boulders that had been deposited by ancient glaciers. This was older country, wilder country, the kind of place where indigenous peoples had retreated when the wave of European settlement made their traditional territories uninhabitable. Emily had studied maps of this region during her legal research, but nothing had prepared her for the raw, spiritual power of being here in person. Every rock formation seemed deliberately placed. Every grove of trees felt like a natural cathedral. Joseph had tried to explain the Mohawk understanding of land as a living entity with its own consciousness, but she was only beginning to comprehend what that meant in practice. The sound reached her before she saw its source, the deep, rhythmic thunder of falling water that managed to penetrate even the howling wind. Emily's heart raced as she pushed through a stand of evergreens and found herself on the edge of a circular valley carved into the mountainside by millennia of erosion. At its center, a waterfall dropped nearly 100 feet from an opening in the cliff face, its normal cascade transformed by the bitter cold into a fantastical sculpture of ice and frozen mist. The sight took her breath away. What had probably been a simple waterfall in summer had become something otherworldly. A column of twisted ice that caught and refracted the weak winter sunlight into patterns that seemed almost conscious. Sheets of frozen spray created a natural amphitheater around the base of the falls, while smaller icicles hung like crystal chimes from every available surface. But it was what lay behind the ice that made Emily's pulse quicken with hope and terror in equal measure. The waterfall had frozen in such a way that it created a translucent curtain across the cliff face, and through the distorted ice she could make out the dark opening of what was unmistakably a cave. Michael had been right. The winter freeze had revealed an entrance that would be completely hidden during warmer months, protected by the constant flow of water that would make approach impossible. Getting to that entrance, however, was going to require climbing skills that Emily wasn't sure she possessed. The ice formations were beautiful, but treacherous, and one slip would send her tumbling into the rocky basin below with enough force to ensure she never got up again. She stood at the edge of the valley for several minutes, studying the frozen landscape and trying to plot a route that wouldn't result in her immediate death. The climbing equipment in her emergency pack was minimal. A single rope, some basic pitons, and the ice axe she had grabbed from her apartment when she first realized she would be fleeing into winter wilderness. It was enough for someone with experience, but Emily's background was in legal research, not technical mountaineering. Every step she took on that ice would be a gamble with her life. But as she stood there calculating risks and odds, Emily heard something that made the decision for her. Voices carried on the wind, still distant, but clearly heading in her direction. Richard's men had found her trail, had followed her tracks to the treaty stone and beyond. She had minutes, maybe less, before they reached this valley and trapped her with nowhere to run. Emily pulled on her climbing gloves and approached the ice face, testing each handhold carefully before committing her weight to it. The frozen waterfall was more solid than she had expected, but also more slippery. Ice chips showered down with each movement, and more than once she felt her grip start to give way before finding a more secure hold. The climb felt like it took hours. Though her watch told her only 20 minutes had passed, every muscle in her body screamed with the effort of supporting her weight while finding the next safe placement for hands and feet. The satchel containing Joseph's evidence made her balance awkward, But she didn't dare leave it behind. Without that documentation, everything she and Joseph had worked for would die with her on this frozen cliff face. Halfway up, Emily made the mistake of looking down. The rocky basin below seemed impossibly far away, and the sight made her head spin with vertigo. She pressed her face against the ice, forcing herself to breathe slowly and focus only on the next hold, the next step. Michael was counting on her. Joseph's memory was counting on her. The countless families whose lives had been destroyed by Blackwood Industries were counting on her. When she finally reached the cave entrance, Emily was so exhausted she nearly fell backward off the ice face. Only a desperate grab for a rocky outcrop saved her from a fatal tumble. She hauled herself through the opening and collapsed on the cave floor, gasping in the sudden stillness after hours of wind and weather. The cave was larger than she had expected, stretching back into darkness beyond the reach of the weak light filtering through the ice curtain. The air inside was still and cold, but noticeably warmer than the howling wilderness outside. More importantly, she could hear no sound of pursuit. The climb she had just completed would challenge even experienced mountaineers, and Richard's hired men were more likely to wait for specialized equipment than attempt it with inadequate gear. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Emily began to make out details of her surroundings. The cave walls bore carved symbols similar to those she had seen on the treaty stone, but these were older, more elaborate. Spiraling patterns seemed to flow around pictographs depicting human figures, animals, and what might have been celestial events. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a sacred site that had been used for ceremonies long before European colonization. Emily pulled a flashlight from her pack and began exploring deeper into the cave system. The main chamber extended back for perhaps 50 feet before branching into several smaller passages. Most were too narrow for human passage, but one wider tunnel seemed to lead further into the mountain. Michael had mentioned an inner chamber, a place where the actual treasures were hidden, and Emily suspected that tunnel was her route to finding them. The passage was tight enough that she had to remove her pack and push it ahead of her in several places, but it was clearly artificial rather than natural. The walls had been carved and smoothed by human hands, creating a corridor that led steadily upward into the heart of the mountain. Symbols covered every surface, and Emily recognized some of them from her studies with Joseph, stories of the creation, maps of star patterns, records of important treaties and battles. After what felt like an hour of crawling and climbing through the narrow passage, Emily emerged into a chamber that took her breath away. Her flashlight beam revealed a circular room perhaps 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. But it was the walls that made her gasp with wonder and disbelief. Every surface was covered with emeralds. Not raw stones, but carved and polished gems that had been set into the rock with such skill that they seemed to grow naturally from the cave walls. Her flashlight beam fragmented into 1,000 points of green fire as it hit the precious stones, creating patterns of light that danced across carved symbols and pictographs like something alive. The effect was so beautiful, so overwhelming, that Emily had to sit down on the stone floor to avoid falling over. This wasn't just a treasure cache, it was a temple, a sacred space where generations of Mohawk craftsmen had created something beyond price. The emeralds weren't simply valuable gems to be sold for profit, they were art, history, and spiritual power combined into something that represented the very soul of a people who had refused to be entirely conquered. Emily approached one wall and ran her fingers over the carved stones, feeling the incredible craftsmanship that had gone into their creation. Each emerald was unique, cut to fit perfectly into patterns that told stories she was only beginning to understand. Some depicted the natural world, animals, plants, seasonal cycles. Others showed human activities, hunting, farming, ceremonies, councils. Still, others seemed to map celestial events or record important historical moments. But as she examined the walls more closely, Emily began to understand the true genius of what Michael's ancestors had created. The emeralds weren't just decorative, they were removable. Each stone was held in place by a carefully crafted setting that would allow it to be extracted without damaging either the gem or the surrounding artwork. The entire chamber was designed as both a permanent memorial and a resource that could be accessed in times of desperate need. Michael had been right about the potential value of what lay hidden here. Even conservative estimates put the worth of the emeralds in the tens of millions of dollars, enough to fund legal battles and land purchase agreements for generations. But Emily was beginning to realize that their true worth went far beyond mere money. These stones represented cultural continuity, the preservation of knowledge and tradition across centuries of persecution and displacement. As she stood in the green firelight, Emily remembered Michael's warning about the songs, about the need to ask permission before taking what she needed. The chamber felt alive around her, filled with presence she couldn't quite define, but definitely sensed. The ancestors Michael had spoken of weren't just metaphors or memories. They were here, watching, judging her worthiness to access treasures that had been hidden for generations. Emily pulled out the stone pendant Michael had given her, feeling its unusual warmth even through her gloves. In the emerald light, she could see that its carved symbols matched those on the chamber walls. It was clearly some kind of key or identification, proof that she came with the blessing of those who had the right to grant access to this sacred space. Following Michael's instructions, Emily began to sing the Thanksgiving song Joseph had taught her, her voice echoing strangely in the domed chamber. The Mohawk words felt unfamiliar on her tongue, but she had practiced them enough to remember the basic melody and meaning. She thanked the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, for sustaining life, asked permission to take what she needed to protect life, and promised to use whatever she was given in service of justice rather than personal gain. As the last notes of her song faded into silence, Emily felt something shift in the atmosphere of the chamber. The emerald light seemed to pulse brighter for a moment, and she could have sworn she heard voices singing in harmony with her own, though she knew she was alone in the cave. Whether it was the ancestors responding to her request, or simply her imagination processing the overwhelming nature of her situation, Emily felt a sense of acceptance, of permission granted. Working carefully, Emily began removing emeralds from their settings, choosing specimens that were large enough to be valuable but not so integral to the pictographs that their removal would damage important stories. She took perhaps 24 stones, each one perfect in its clarity and color, each one worth enough to fund months of legal action against Blackwood Industries. But even as she filled a small bag with emeralds, Emily found herself thinking about Joseph and Michael, about the price that had been paid to bring her to this moment. The stones in her hands represented more than just a means to continue their legal battle. They were a trust, a responsibility that went beyond anything she had ever taken on before. As she prepared to leave the chamber, Emily heard something that made her blood run cold. Voices echoed from the main cave, harsh and professional. Richard's men had found a way up the ice face, had tracked her into the sacred space where she had hoped to find safety. She was trapped in the heart of the mountain, with nowhere left to run, carrying treasure that would die with her if she couldn't find another way out. The sound of boots on stone told her that her pursuers were already exploring the cave system, searching for the passage that led to her current location. Emily turned off her flashlight and listened in the darkness, trying to estimate how much time she had before they discovered the narrow tunnel she had used to reach the emerald chamber. That's when she noticed something she had missed before, a faint current of air flowing across her face from somewhere behind the carved walls. There was another passage, another way out of the chamber that she hadn't seen in her initial exploration. Emily felt along the wall, where the air current seemed strongest, running her hands over carved symbols until she found what felt like a crack between sections of stone. It was another tunnel, even narrower than the one she had used to enter, but it clearly led somewhere. The air flowing through it carried scents of the outside world, pine trees, snow, the clean smell of winter wilderness. If she could squeeze through the opening, if she could follow the passage wherever it led, she might still escape with the emeralds and the evidence that could bring down Blackwood Industries. Emily stuffed the bag of emeralds into her jacket and began working her way into the new passage, pushing her pack ahead of her as she had before. Behind her, she could hear voices getting closer, the sound of flashlight beams probing the main chamber she had just vacated. Richard's men were thorough and persistent, but they were also operating in unfamiliar territory, following someone who had been guided by knowledge they couldn't access. The new tunnel was a nightmare of tight spaces and rough stone, but Emily forced herself through it by focusing on the memory of Michael's dying words, on Joseph's dedication to justice, on all the families whose lives had been destroyed by corporate greed. Every scraped knee and bruised elbow was payment for the chance to continue their work, to turn the hidden treasures of the ancestors into weapons against the modern colonizers who thought money could buy immunity from consequences. After what felt like hours of crawling through increasingly narrow spaces, Emily saw light ahead. Not the artificial glow of flashlights, but the grey light of winter afternoon filtering through what looked like a crack in the mountainside. She pushed herself toward that light with the last of her strength, squeezing through an opening barely wide enough for her body until she tumbled out onto a snow-covered ledge high on the opposite side of the mountain from where she had entered the cave system. The view was spectacular and terrifying. She was hundreds of feet above the valley floor, perched on a ledge that would have been invisible from below, even if someone had known where to look. The cave system she had just navigated was clearly much more extensive than anyone realized, with multiple entrances and passages that had been carved by people who understood the value of having alternative escape routes. Emily could see Richard's men in the distance, tiny figures moving around the base of the frozen waterfall where she had begun her climb. They were clearly frustrated, probably wondering how she had simply vanished from a cave system they thought. They had completely surrounded. The ledge where she now sat was invisible from their position, hidden by the natural contours of the mountain and the clever placement of the exit passage. For the first time since finding Michael dying in the snow, Emily allowed herself to hope that she might actually survive this ordeal. She had the emeralds, she still had Joseph's evidence, and she had found a way out of what had seemed like certain death, but she was far from safe. The ledge was exposed to the winter weather, and she still had to find a way down the mountain that wouldn't involve falling to her death or walking straight into another ambush. As she caught her breath and planned her next move, Emily realized that everything about her life had changed during her time in the Emerald Chamber. She was no longer Emily Blackwood, dutiful stepdaughter running away from family expectations. She was someone new, someone who had been entrusted with treasures and responsibilities that went far beyond her individual survival. The emeralds in her jacket pocket felt warm against her body, as if they carried some of the spiritual energy of the sacred chamber where they had been created. But more than that, they represented a bridge between past and future, between the indigenous wisdom that had hidden them and the modern legal system that might finally use them to achieve justice. Emily looked out across the wilderness that had nearly killed her, and felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of purpose that went beyond her own fears and desires. She was carrying the hopes of the dead and the dreams of the living, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she was meant to do with the gifts she had been given. The descent from the hidden ledge took Emily through terrain that would have challenged an experienced mountaineer, but desperation and adrenaline carried her down slopes of loose rock and patches of treacherous ice that should have been impossible to navigate safely. Every step was calculated risk, every handhold a gamble with gravity that could end her mission before she had a chance to use what she had discovered in the Emerald Chamber. By the time she reached the tree line, darkness was falling across the mountains, and Emily knew she had to find shelter before hypothermia claimed her life as surely as any bullet from Richard's hired killers. The bag of emeralds felt impossibly heavy in her jacket pocket, their weight a constant reminder of the responsibility she now carried. These weren't just precious stones anymore, they were the crystallized hopes of generations who had refused to surrender their heritage to conquest and greed. Emily's knowledge of wilderness survival was theoretical at best, gleaned from legal cases involving environmental disasters and land use disputes rather than practical experience. But something had changed during her time in the sacred chamber. Some fundamental shift in her relationship with the natural world that Joseph had tried to explain, but which she had never truly understood until now. The forest around her no longer felt hostile and alien. Instead, it seemed to offer guidance to someone who knew how to listen. She found what she was looking for in a grove of ancient pines, whose thick canopy had created a natural shelter from the worst of the wind and snow. The space beneath the largest tree was almost cave-like, protected by low-hanging branches that formed walls against the elements, while allowing just enough airflow to prevent carbon dioxide buildup. Emily gathered pine needles and dead branches to create insulation from the frozen ground, then wrapped herself in the emergency sleeping bag she had grabbed during her frantic escape from Albany. Sleep should have been impossible given the cold, the danger, and the magnitude of what she had discovered. But exhaustion finally claimed her, and Emily found herself dreaming of the Emerald Chamber, of voices singing in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. In her dreams, she walked through landscapes that were simultaneously the wilderness she was hiding in, and the thriving indigenous communities that had once called these mountains home. She woke before dawn to the sound of helicopters in the distance, their rotors beating a rhythm that sent ice through her veins. Richard had escalated the search, bringing in aerial surveillance that would make her movements across open ground virtually impossible to conceal. Emily forced herself to eat some of the energy bars from her pack, washing them down with water she had melted from snow, while her mind raced through increasingly desperate options for reaching civilization without being detected. The helicopters weren't just searching randomly. Through gaps in the pine canopy, Emily could see searchlights sweeping methodically across the mountainside, following a grid pattern that would eventually cover every possible hiding place. Richard's resources seemed unlimited, and his willingness to use them suggested he understood exactly how damaging the evidence in her possession could be to his empire. That's when Emily remembered something Joseph had told her during one of their long research sessions. The Mohawk had maintained a network of traditional trails through these mountains, paths that connected sacred sites and seasonal camps, while remaining invisible to outsiders who didn't know how to read the landscape. Many of these routes were still used by tribal members who preferred to travel according to ancient patterns rather than modern convenience. Finding one of these hidden trails would require skills Emily wasn't sure she possessed, but Joseph had taught her the basics of reading landscape markers that indicated indigenous travel routes. Certain tree formations, arrangements of stones, even the growth patterns of specific plants could indicate pathways that had been used for centuries. The key was learning to see the forest as a living map rather than just a collection of individual features. Emily spent the morning moving carefully through the wilderness, studying every detail of her surroundings, while the helicopters continued their methodical search in the distance. The traditional markers were subtle, often indistinguishable from natural formations unless you knew what to look for. But gradually, she began to notice patterns, stones placed in configurations that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, blazes on trees that formed directional indicators when viewed from the correct angle. The trail, when she finally found it, was almost invisible. What looked like a game path to casual observation revealed itself as something more purposeful when Emily examined it with the knowledge Joseph had shared. The route followed natural contours that would minimize visibility from aerial surveillance while providing access to water sources and sheltered camping spots. It was the kind of infrastructure that could only have been developed by people who had intimate knowledge of this landscape across generations. Following the trail required constant attention to subtle markers that indicated direction and distance. Emily found herself developing skills she had never known she possessed, reading the forest with an intuition that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her conscious mind. The emeralds in her pocket felt warm against her body, and sometimes she imagined she could hear whispered guidance from voices that belonged to no one she could see. The ancient pathway led her through terrain that was simultaneously beautiful and dangerous, across ridgelines that offered spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness, and through valleys where the silence was so complete it felt sacred. Emily began to understand why these mountains had been considered holy by the Mohawk, why they had hidden their most precious treasures in caves carved into these particular peaks. As she traveled, Emily's mind kept returning to the legal case that had started this entire ordeal. The evidence in her satchel documented not just environmental crimes, but a systematic pattern of cultural destruction that went far beyond simple corporate greed. Blackwood Industries hadn't just poisoned watersheds and displaced families. They had deliberately targeted sites of spiritual significance, using their operations to sever the connections between indigenous communities and the landscapes that defined their identity. The emeralds she carried represented more than just funding for legal battles. They were proof that some things had survived the centuries of attempted destruction, that the deepest treasures of a culture could remain hidden until the right moment came to reveal them. In her hands, these stones could become weapons against the kind of systematic oppression that had been devastating indigenous communities since the first European ships reached North American shores. By afternoon, Emily could hear the helicopters growing more distant as their search pattern moved to other areas of the mountains. Either Richard's men had given up on finding her in this particular region, or they had been called away to search locations where she was more likely to be hiding. The ancient trail had apparently accomplished its purpose, keeping her invisible to modern surveillance while guiding her toward whatever destination the ancestors had intended. The trail emerged from dense forest onto a ridge that overlooked a broad valley Emily didn't recognize from any map she had studied. Below her, she could see smoke rising from what looked like a collection of traditional buildings. Their design, distinctly indigenous but clearly modern in construction. As she studied the settlement through her binoculars, Emily realized she was looking at something extraordinary, a contemporary Mohawk community that had maintained traditional architecture and land use patterns while remaining completely hidden from outside observation. The village was larger than it had first appeared, with perhaps 50 buildings, arranged according to principles that maximized both functionality and spiritual significance. Gardens and agricultural areas were integrated seamlessly with the natural landscape, creating a settlement that seemed to have grown organically from the land itself rather than being imposed upon it. Solar panels and modern communication equipment were discreetly incorporated into designs that otherwise looked like they could have been built centuries ago. Emily spent an hour watching the community from her hidden vantage point, trying to determine if approaching them would be safe or catastrophic. These people had clearly gone to enormous lengths to remain invisible to the outside world, and her arrival could represent either salvation or disaster for their carefully maintained isolation. But she was running out of options, and the emeralds in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth whenever she looked toward the village below. The decision was made for her when a figure emerged from the tree line behind her, moving with the silent precision of someone who had been tracking her movements for some time. Emily spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife in her pack, but stopped when she saw the person approaching her. It was a woman perhaps her own age, dressed in a combination of traditional and modern clothing that seemed to mirror the architectural style of the village below. Her long black hair was braided with beads and feathers that caught the afternoon light, and her dark eyes held the same depth of wisdom Emily had seen in Michael's gaze during his final moments. Most importantly, she wore a pendant around her neck that was clearly carved from the same stone as the one Michael had given Emily. "You're carrying something that belongs to us," the woman said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Something taken from the sacred chamber where only the ancestors should tread." Emily's heart raced as she realized her situation had become even more complicated. She had assumed that finding the emeralds would be the end of her quest. But apparently it was only the beginning. These people clearly knew about the hidden treasure, possibly had been guarding it for generations, and her unauthorized access might be viewed as theft rather than rescue. "Michael Two Feathers gave me this," Emily said, pulling out the stone pendant and hoping it would serve as protection rather than evidence of her guilt. "He was dying in the snow, told me about the chamber, said Joseph had spoken of me." The woman's expression shifted slightly at the mention of the names, but her stance remained wary. "Michael is my brother. Joseph was our cousin. Both of them are dead because they trusted someone from your world." She stepped closer, studying Emily with eyes that seemed to see far more than surface appearances. "The question is whether their trust was misplaced, or whether you've become something different than what you were born to be." Emily found herself being escorted down paths that were even more carefully concealed than the trail she had been following. The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah Lightfoot, moved through the forest with an economy of motion that made Emily feel clumsy and loud by comparison. Every step seemed placed to minimize impact on the surrounding environment while maintaining perfect balance and silence. "This place doesn't exist on any map," Sarah explained as they approached the village. "We've spent 3 generations creating a community that can maintain traditional ways while remaining invisible to satellites and government surveillance. The emeralds you found have been part of our security for longer than most people realize." The village was even more impressive up close than it had appeared from the ridge. The buildings were constructed using techniques that seemed to blend indigenous knowledge with modern engineering, creating structures that were both beautiful and incredibly functional. Solar panels were integrated into roof lines designed according to traditional proportions, while gardens followed permaculture principles that had been developed centuries before Europeans coined the term. Emily found herself in a council chamber that felt both ancient and contemporary, surrounded by tribal elders whose presence commanded respect in ways that had nothing to do with formal authority. These were people who had dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge and traditions that colonization had tried to erase, and their attention focused on her with an intensity that was both welcoming and terrifying. The eldest among them was a man whose weathered face seemed to hold the stories of countless generations. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and the pain of historical memory. "The stones you carry were placed in that chamber by my great-grandfather when the cavalry came to drive us from our traditional territories. They were meant to be insurance against the day when our people would need resources to reclaim what was stolen." Emily removed the bag of emeralds from her jacket, placing it on the carved wooden table that dominated the center of the chamber. The stones caught the light from traditional oil lamps, throwing patterns of green fire across the walls in ways that seemed almost alive. I don't want to keep them for myself. I want to use them the way Michael said Joseph intended, to fund legal battles against the people who are still stealing from you. The corporations, another elder said, her voice sharp with anger and pain. They come with papers and permits, claiming legal ownership of land that was never ours to sell in the first place. They poison the water, destroy the sacred sites, treat the earth like property instead of our mother. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Emily had experienced in her previous legal career. These people understood the environmental and cultural damage being done by companies like Blackwood Industries with a clarity that came from centuries of experience with systematic oppression. But they also possessed knowledge about legal strategies and historical precedents that could transform how indigenous rights cases were argued in contemporary courts. The emeralds alone won't be enough, Sarah explained, studying the stones Emily had brought from the sacred chamber. They're valuable, but Richard Blackwood has resources that go far beyond simple money. He has political connections, media influence, the ability to make problems disappear permanently. But they're not just emeralds, Emily realized, her mind racing as she began to understand the full implications of what she had discovered. They're artifacts, proof of continuous occupation and cultural practice. In combination with the environmental evidence Joseph collected, they could establish not just damages, but original title to the land itself. The legal theory that began to emerge from their discussion was revolutionary in its implications. Instead of simply suing for environmental damages, they could potentially challenge the fundamental basis of European land claims in North America. The emeralds, created by indigenous craftsmen and hidden according to traditional protocols, represented cultural continuity that predated any colonial legal system. It's never been tried at this scale, Emily admitted, her excitement growing as she worked through the potential arguments. But the legal precedents exist. Indigenous title based on continuous occupation and cultural practice, environmental protection based on treaty obligations, criminal prosecution for systematic violation of federal law. And if we lose, asked the eldest council member, if we lose, we'll have forced them to reveal their methods and resources in open court. We'll have created a legal record that other communities can build on, and we'll have shown that resistance is possible even against enemies who seem impossibly powerful. The council deliberated in a language Emily didn't understand, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to echo the natural patterns of the forest around them. Finally, the eldest member turned back to her with an expression that managed to combine hope and resignation in equal measure. The emeralds will remain here, he said, but you will have access to them as needed for legal expenses. More importantly, you will have our knowledge, our documentation, our witnesses. We will come out of hiding to stand with you in this fight. Emily felt tears freezing on her cheeks as the magnitude of what was being offered sank in. These people were risking everything they had built, everything they had protected across generations, to support a legal battle that might fail catastrophically. They were trusting her with more than just treasure. They were trusting her with their future. There's something else you need to understand, Sarah said as the council session concluded. The moment we file these cases, the moment we challenge Blackwood Industries in court, we become targets. Not just legal targets, but physical ones. Richard Blackwood has already shown he's willing to commit murder to protect his interests. Emily thought about Joseph's broken body at the bottom of that ravine, about Michael dying in the snow, about all the families who had been poisoned and displaced because they stood in the way of corporate profits. He's already committed murder. The only question is whether we're going to let him get away with it." As night fell over the hidden village, Emily found herself in a guest lodge that had been prepared with traditional hospitality but modern comfort. The bag of emeralds sat on a table beside her bed, their green fire dim in the lamplight, but somehow still present, still alive with possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of her commitment to the path she had chosen. But tonight, for the first time since Joseph's death, Emily felt like she was no longer fighting alone. She had allies now, people who understood both the stakes and the strategies necessary to challenge enemies, who had seemed invincible just days before. The emeralds had been just the beginning. What lay ahead would require every skill she had, developed every connection she could forge, every ounce of courage she could summon. But as she prepared for sleep in a place that existed between worlds, Emily knew she had finally found her true purpose in life. The war room that Sarah led Emily into the next morning bore little resemblance to the traditional council chamber, where they had met the tribal elders. This space hummed with modern technology, banks of computers, satellite communication equipment, and monitoring systems that would have impressed any corporate intelligence operation. Maps covered every wall, marked with color-coded pins that tracked everything from mining operations to water contamination levels across 3 states. "You thought we were just hiding in the woods, preserving the old ways," Sarah said with a slight smile as she watched Emily's amazement. "But survival in the modern world requires modern tools. We've been documenting Blackwood Industries' crimes for 15 years, building cases we never had the resources to file." The scope of evidence was staggering. Emily found herself looking at surveillance footage of illegal dumping operations, water samples that showed contamination levels far exceeding federal safety standards, and financial records that documented a pattern of bribery and corruption stretching back decades. This wasn't just environmental crime, it was systematic racketeering on a scale that could bring down entire corporate hierarchies. "How did you get all this?" Emily asked, studying security camera footage that appeared to be filmed from inside Blackwood Industries facilities. "Joseph wasn't our only ally in the outside world," Sarah replied, calling up files on her computer that showed a network of connections Emily hadn't imagined. Environmental scientists, tribal members working in corporate positions, government, employees who still believe in their oath to protect the public interest, people who've been waiting for someone with the legal skills and resources to turn evidence into justice. The plan that emerged from their morning strategy session was breathtaking in its audacity. Rather than filing a single lawsuit, they would launch a coordinated assault across multiple jurisdictions, combining environmental crimes with violations of indigenous rights, federal racketeering charges, and international human rights complaints. Each case would support the others, creating a web of legal challenges that would overwhelm Blackwood Industries' ability to respond effectively. Emily's role would be central, but not solitary. Sarah had connections with indigenous rights attorneys across North America, environmental law specialists who had been building cases against extractive industries for years, and international human rights organizations that could apply pressure through channels Richard Blackwood couldn't control or intimidate. "The emeralds give us independence," Sarah explained, as they worked through financial projections for the massive legal campaign they were planning. "But more than that, they give us credibility. Courts take cases more seriously when they're backed by clients who can afford the best representation, and media outlets pay attention to stories involving real treasure rather than abstract legal theories." The first test of their alliance came sooner than either of them had expected. As they worked through the afternoon, refining legal strategies and coordinating with allies across the continent, Sarah's communication systems began picking up alarming intelligence. Richard Blackwood wasn't content to wait for law enforcement to track down his missing stepdaughter. He was mobilizing private military contractors, the kind of mercenaries who specialized in operations that governments couldn't officially acknowledge. 48 men, Sarah reported grimly, studying satellite imagery that showed the mercenaries' camp being established at the base of the mountains. Professional soldiers with military-grade equipment. They're not planning to take prisoners. Emily felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just corporate crime anymore, it was war. Richard was so determined to protect his empire that he was willing to commit mass murder against an entire indigenous community that had done nothing but try to preserve their heritage and protect their environment. "We have to evacuate the village," Emily said, her mind racing through scenarios that all seemed to end in disaster. "Get everyone out before they find this place." "Run where?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "This is our home, our sacred land. These mountains hold the bones of our ancestors, the stories of our people. If we abandon them now, Richard Blackwood wins, even if we eventually prevail in court." The council that convened that evening was unlike anything Emily had witnessed. Representatives from not just their hidden community, but from Mohawk settlements across the region gathered in person or participated through encrypted video links. The discussion moved fluidly between English and Mohawk, but Emily could follow the essential debate, whether to stand and fight or preserve the community through strategic retreat. The eldest council member, whose name Emily learned was Thomas, Standing Bear, finally spoke with the authority of someone whose words carried the weight of generations. "Our grandfathers faced cavalry and cannons with nothing but arrows and determination. They lost battles, but preserved the people, preserved the knowledge that allows us to be here today discussing these choices. But they also hid the emeralds," Sarah pointed out. "They prepared for the day when we would have resources to fight back effectively. That day has come." What emerged from the debate was a strategy that combined the wisdom of traditional indigenous warfare with modern asymmetric tactics. The village would not be abandoned, but its vulnerable members, children, elders, those with medical conditions, would be evacuated to safe locations, while a core group remained to defend their homeland and support the legal battle Emily was preparing to launch. Emily found herself assigned a role she had never imagined, not just lawyer, but strategic coordinator for a resistance operation that would combine legal warfare with guerrilla tactics designed to frustrate and expose the mercenary force Richard had assembled. Her knowledge of corporate structures and legal vulnerabilities would be essential for targeting Blackwood Industries' weak points, while the community's intimate knowledge of the terrain would neutralize the advantages of superior firepower. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of preparation that transformed the peaceful mountain community into something resembling a military operation. Hidden caches of supplies were established throughout the mountains. Communication networks were tested and reinforced, and escape routes were prepared for scenarios ranging from successful evacuation to last-ditch resistance. Emily spent her time working with a team of lawyers who seemed to materialize from nowhere, indigenous rights specialists and environmental attorneys who had been waiting years for an opportunity like this. The legal documents they prepared were unlike anything she had worked on before. Complex, multi-jurisdictional filings that would simultaneously challenge Blackwood Industries in federal court, state environmental agencies, international human rights tribunals, and the court of public opinion. "We file everything at once," explained Maria Santos, a Chicana environmental lawyer who had been fighting extractive industries across the Southwest for 20 years. Coordinated releases to media outlets in 6 countries, simultaneous legal actions in 12 jurisdictions, criminal referrals to federal prosecutors who've been building cases against corporate environmental crimes. The media strategy was as sophisticated as the legal approach. Rather than relying on traditional outlets that Richard could influence or intimidate, they had partnered with indigenous media networks, environmental journalists with international reach, and social media influencers who could bypass corporate gatekeepers entirely. The story of the Emerald Treasure, combined with documented evidence of environmental crimes, would create the kind of viral narrative that was impossible to suppress through conventional means. Emily's personal story became central to the media campaign in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable but strategically necessary. The narrative of a corporate heiress turning against her own family to fight for indigenous rights and environmental justice was powerful enough to capture public attention in ways that abstract legal arguments never could. "You're the bridge," Sarah explained as they prepared talking points for interviews that would begin the moment their legal filings became public. "Someone from their world who chose our world, who can speak to audiences that would never listen to indigenous voices on their own." The irony wasn't lost on Emily that her privileged background, which had always felt like a burden and a source of guilt, was now becoming a weapon in the fight for justice. Her insider knowledge of how corporate power operated, her connections within legal and political circles, her ability to speak the language of the establishment, all of it was valuable precisely because she was turning it against the system that had created her. As the legal documents neared completion and the media campaign prepared to launch, Emily found herself spending long hours with the emeralds themselves. The stones had been moved from the sacred chamber to a secure location within the village, but they remained available for the detailed documentation and expert evaluation that would be required for court proceedings. Working with gemologists and indigenous art historians who had been brought in to establish the stone's provenance and value, Emily began to understand the true sophistication of what Michael's ancestors had created. Each emerald was not just a precious stone, but a work of art that incorporated traditional knowledge about geology, astronomy, and spiritual practices. The collection represented nothing less than a condensed encyclopedia of Mohawk culture, preserved in a form that was both beautiful and practically indestructible. Conservative estimate puts the total value at $87 million, reported Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a gemologist from the Smithsonian who had been brought in to evaluate the collection. But that's just the monetary worth of the stones themselves. As cultural artifacts with documented provenance and spiritual significance, they're literally priceless. The legal implications were staggering. Under federal laws protecting indigenous cultural heritage, any attempt to seize or damage the emeralds could result in criminal charges that carried decades in prison. International treaties protecting indigenous rights created additional layers of legal protection that extended far beyond U.S. jurisdiction. Richard Blackwood's mercenaries weren't just planning to attack a hidden community, they were preparing to commit cultural genocide under the eyes of the world. Emily's final night in the mountain village was spent in ceremony, participating in rituals that honored both the ancestors who had hidden the emeralds and the uncertain future that awaited everyone involved in their cause. She had been formally adopted into the clan, given a name in Mohawk that translated roughly as bridge between worlds, and entrusted with responsibilities that went far beyond any legal case. As dawn approached and the time came to begin their coordinated assault on Blackwood Industries, Emily found herself transformed in ways that went far deeper than professional development or political awakening. The frightened woman who had fled into the wilderness just days before was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered not just courage but purpose that transcended personal survival. Sarah approached as Emily made final preparations for the helicopter that would take her to Albany, where she would file the first of their legal actions and begin the media campaign that would make their struggle visible to the world. "You know, there's no going back after this," Sarah said, her expression serious, despite the early morning light that made the mountain landscape look almost magical. "Once we file these cases, once we make ourselves visible, Richard Blackwood will use every resource he has to destroy us. Not just defeat us in court, but eliminate us entirely." Emily looked out across the valley, where the hidden community had preserved traditions and knowledge for generations, where people had chosen to live according to principles that prioritized harmony with the natural world over accumulation of individual wealth. She thought about Joseph dying for his commitment to justice and Michael sacrificing his life to ensure the emeralds reached someone who could use them effectively. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she replied, feeling the weight of the emerald pendant Sarah had given her as a symbol of her new responsibilities. "Whatever happens, we're going to make them pay for every crime, expose every corruption, fight for every poisoned watershed and displaced family." The helicopter that lifted Emily out of the mountains carried more than just a passenger returning to civilization. It carried the hopes of a people who had survived centuries of attempted destruction, the concentrated wisdom of ancestors who had planned for this moment across generations, and the focused rage of someone who had finally found a cause worth dying for. Below them, the landscape spread out in patterns that revealed the complex relationships between human activity and natural systems, the delicate balance that industrial exploitation threatened to destroy permanently. But it also showed the resilience of both land and people, the capacity for renewal and resistance that made victory possible even against seemingly impossible odds. As the mountains fell away behind them and the urban landscape of the capital region came into view, Emily felt herself crossing a threshold that made all her previous life transitions seem trivial by comparison. She was no longer just a lawyer, taking on a difficult case, no longer just an individual seeking personal redemption through political action. She was a warrior carrying sacred trust into battle against enemies who had never faced opposition that combined traditional indigenous wisdom with modern legal and technological capabilities. The emeralds were just the beginning of what they would bring to this fight. The real treasure was the alliance they had forged, the network they had built, the vision they shared of a world where justice was possible and the earth was treated with the respect it deserved. The morning sun painted the federal courthouse in Manhattan with golden light as Emily adjusted the traditional beadwork on her jacket one final time. Today marked exactly 1 year since she had first filed the lawsuit that would become known as the Emerald Precedent, and the appeals court was about to deliver its final ruling on the most significant environmental justice case in American history. The steps of the courthouse overflowed with supporters who had traveled from across the globe to witness this moment. Indigenous leaders wore their finest regalia, environmental activists carried banners in dozens of languages, and legal scholars positioned themselves to capture every word of what many predicted would be a landmark decision that redefined corporate accountability forever. Emily felt the familiar warmth of the emerald pendant against her chest as she walked through the crowd. No longer the desperate fugitive who had stumbled through winter mountains, but a woman who had discovered her true calling in the crucible of resistance. The transformation had been so complete that photographs of her corporate lawyer days seemed to show a different person entirely, someone who had existed in a world she could barely remember. Sarah walked beside her, wearing the ceremonial dress that had been passed down through 5 generations of her family. The partnership they had forged in those desperate early days had evolved into something deeper than friendship or professional. In collaboration, They were sisters in the truest sense, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect that had been tested in fires that would have destroyed weaker bonds. The courtroom itself was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens that had been set up in adjacent buildings. Judge Elena Rodriguez, who had been chosen to hear the appeal because of her expertise in both environmental law and indigenous rights, commanded attention with an authority that silenced even the massive media presence. Emily rose when called upon, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one corporate criminal or one collection of sacred stones. The decision rendered today would determine whether indigenous communities worldwide could use their cultural heritage as legal weapons against extractive industries that had operated with impunity for centuries. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "this case represents more than legal precedent. It represents the fundamental question of whether this nation will honor its treaty obligations to indigenous peoples or continue to allow corporate interests to destroy what cannot be replaced." The evidence she presented had been refined through months of appellate preparation, but its power remained undimmed. Video testimony from elders who had maintained oral histories for generations, scientific analysis proving the emerald's cultural significance, and documentation of environmental crimes that stretched back decades painted a picture of systematic oppression that demanded justice. Richard Blackwood sat in the defendant's section, his expensive legal team unable to conceal their client's obvious deterioration. Prison had aged him dramatically, but more than that, the complete destruction of his corporate empire had broken something fundamental in his spirit. The man who had once commanded vast resources now faced additional criminal charges in 3 countries and civil lawsuits that would continue for decades. The emeralds themselves were present in the courtroom, displayed in a secure case that allowed their green fire to catch the light streaming through tall windows. Even skeptical observers found themselves mesmerized by the stones, which seemed to pulse with life and meaning that transcended their monetary value. When Sarah took the witness stand to describe the spiritual significance of the sacred chamber where the emeralds had been preserved, her words created a silence so profound that even the court reporters seemed to pause in their work. Speaking in accented English that carried the rhythms of her native language, she painted a picture of cultural continuity that had survived 5 centuries of attempted destruction. "These stones are not treasures in the way white people understand wealth," Sarah explained, her dark eyes holding the attention of every person in the courtroom. "They are ancestors, teachers, guardians of knowledge that your schools and churches tried to erase." When Emily found them, she found more than gems. She found proof that we have never surrendered, never stopped being who we were meant to be. The defense attorney's attempts to challenge the evidence fell apart under cross-examination that revealed the depth of Emily's preparation. Every piece of documentation had been verified by multiple sources. Every witness had been prepared for attacks on their credibility, and every legal argument had been constructed to withstand the most aggressive corporate opposition. The media coverage had evolved far beyond simple news reporting to become a global conversation about corporate accountability and indigenous rights. Social media campaigns had made the Emerald case a symbol of successful resistance to extractive capitalism, while documentary filmmakers from 5 countries were already producing features that would ensure the story reached audiences worldwide. International pressure had mounted throughout the appeals process as environmental organizations and indigenous rights groups recognized the global implications of the case. The United Nations had filed an amicus brief supporting Emily's position, while the European Union had indicated that corporate entities found guilty of cultural destruction would face sanctions that could affect their operations across multiple continents. The personal cost of Emily's transformation had been enormous but necessary. Her mother remained estranged, choosing loyalty to Richard's memory over reconciliation with her daughter. Former colleagues in corporate law continued to view Emily as a traitor to their profession, while death threats from extractive industry supporters required ongoing security precautions that complicated every aspect of her daily life. But the family she had gained far exceeded what she had lost. The mountain community had embraced her completely, and her adoption ceremony had been recognized by tribal councils across North America as legitimate inheritance of responsibilities that went far beyond legal advocacy. She had learned to speak Mohawk fluently, participated in seasonal ceremonies that connected her to spiritual practices older than any European tradition, and developed skills in traditional crafts that honored the artistic heritage preserved. In the Emerald Chamber, the legal training program she had established at the Cultural Center was already producing graduates who were filing similar cases across the continent. Young Indigenous lawyers were learning to combine traditional ecological knowledge with modern legal theory, creating strategies for environmental protection that drew strength from sources corporate lawyers couldn't understand or counter. Emily's romantic relationship with David Clearwater had deepened into partnership that encompassed both personal and professional dimensions. Joseph's younger brother had proven himself invaluable in coordinating legal strategies across multiple jurisdictions. While his intimate knowledge of tribal politics helped Emily navigate complexities she was still learning to understand. Their engagement had been announced at a traditional ceremony that drew representatives from dozens of Indigenous communities, marking not just personal commitment, but political alliance between families dedicated to environmental justice. The wedding was planned for the summer solstice, with celebrations that would honor both Mohawk traditions and Emily's adopted status as bridge between worlds. Judge Rodriguez's deliberation lasted 3 hours before she returned to deliver a verdict that would reshape environmental law across North America. The courtroom fell silent as she began reading from prepared remarks that had clearly been crafted with awareness of their historical significance. This court finds that the appellants have established beyond any reasonable doubt that Indigenous cultural artifacts constitute valid evidence of land title under both federal treaty obligations and international law, Judge Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Furthermore, the systematic destruction of such cultural sites constitutes criminal conspiracy that warrants the harshest penalties available under federal sentencing guidelines. The eruption of celebration that followed was unlike anything the courthouse had ever witnessed. Indigenous leaders embraced each other with tears of joy and relief, while environmental activists cheered a victory that exceeded their most optimistic projections. The Emerald precedent had been upheld and strengthened, creating legal foundations that other communities could immediately begin using to challenge corporate operations worldwide. Emily found herself surrounded by people who had become more than allies, but family in the deepest sense of the word. Sarah embraced her with fierce pride, while tribal elders who had traveled thousands of miles to witness this moment offered blessings in languages that predated any colonial influence. The immediate implications were staggering. Within hours of the verdict, Indigenous communities across 12 states had filed preliminary injunctions halting extractive industry operations on traditional territories. Similar cases were already being prepared in Canada, Australia, and South America, where Indigenous rights advocates had been monitoring the Emerald case as a potential model for their own struggles. Corporate stock prices plummeted as investors realized the full scope of the new legal landscape. Mining companies that had operated with confidence in their political protection suddenly faced the possibility of being shut down entirely if they couldn't prove their operations weren't destroying indigenous cultural sites. The economic impact was immediate and severe, but it was also necessary for creating incentives that prioritized long-term environmental health over short-term profit extraction. Emily's press conference following the verdict drew international attention that transformed her into a global symbol of successful resistance to corporate colonialism. But she used that platform strategically, always redirecting attention to the communities she represented and the ongoing struggles for environmental justice that extended far beyond her individual story. This victory belongs to everyone who refused to accept that corporate power was more important than cultural survival, Emily told the assembled media, her words broadcast live across 6 continents. It belongs to the ancestors who preserved the emeralds through centuries of persecution, to the communities that welcomed a stranger and taught her what it means to fight for something larger than yourself. The celebration that evening brought together people from dozens of tribal communities in a gathering that honored both the legal victory and the traditional values that had made it possible. The Emerald Chamber itself had been open to visitors for the first time since the trial began, allowing supporters to experience the sacred space where Emily's transformation had reached its completion. Standing among the green fire of the ancient stones, Emily reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate flight to purposeful leadership. The frightened woman who had stumbled through winter mountains seeking only survival had discovered that true security came not from avoiding risk, but from choosing risks that served purposes larger than individual safety. The emeralds glowed with the same mysterious inner light that had first amazed her. But now she understood that their power came not from monetary value or even artistic beauty. They represented the preserved wisdom of people who had faced seemingly impossible odds and found ways to maintain their essential identity across centuries of systematic oppression. Emily's own story had become part of that continuing narrative of resistance and renewal. The legal victories she had achieved were significant, but they were also temporary, unless each generation renewed the commitment to justice that made such victories possible. The Emerald Chamber would inspire future activists and legal advocates, but only if they brought the same courage and creativity that had transformed a desperate escape into a revolutionary legal strategy. The environmental restoration projects funded by corporate settlements were already showing measurable results across 3 watersheds, but the real transformation lay in changed relationships between indigenous communities and government agencies that had historically viewed tribal sovereignty as obstacle rather than resource. Federal environmental protection efforts now routinely consulted with traditional ecological knowledge holders, while state governments were establishing new protocols for protecting indigenous cultural sites from corporate exploitation. Emily's role as director of the Indigenous Legal Training Center had attracted students from across the hemisphere who came to study environmental law in a program that emphasized traditional wisdom alongside modern legal theory. The curriculum she had developed combined technical legal skills with cultural education that prepared graduates to serve their communities with both professional competence and spiritual understanding. The network of similar communities, inspired by the mountain village's example, had grown to encompass dozens of locations across North America, where indigenous peoples were revitalizing traditional land management practices while incorporating modern technology for sustainable development. These communities served as both practical models for environmental protection and spiritual centers for cultural renewal that drew strength from sources corporate colonialism couldn't understand or destroy. As winter approached the anniversary of her first desperate flight into the mountains, Emily prepared for the seasonal ceremonies that marked the community's spiritual calendar. She had learned to read weather patterns in ways that connected her intimately to natural cycles, to identify medicinal plants that grew in specific seasons, and to participate in harvest rituals that honored the reciprocal relationships between human communities and the natural world that sustained them. The death threats and security concerns that complicated her daily life were constant reminders that the work remained dangerous. But they also served as evidence that corporate interests recognized the transformative power of what she had accomplished. The Emerald Precedent had created legal tools that were being used by communities worldwide to challenge extractive industries that had operated with impunity for generations. Emily's relationship with the natural world had been transformed completely as her legal and political understanding. She could navigate by stars and landforms rather than electronic devices, track animals through forest environments that had once seemed impenetrable, and sense environmental disturbances before instruments detected them. Her connection to the land had become so intimate that monitoring ongoing restoration efforts felt like checking on the health of family members. The anniversary of Michael's death was approaching, and Emily had planned a ceremony that would bring together representatives from indigenous communities across the continent to honor the dying warrior whose final words had changed the course of environmental law. She would speak about the trust he had placed in a stranger from the world that had oppressed his people, describing how his faith had made everything that followed possible. Standing in the Emerald Chamber as the first winter storms approached the mountains, Emily felt the weight of the pendant around her neck not as burden but as blessing. She had been chosen for this role by forces larger than individual ambition or political calculation, and she had used that trust to create changes that would benefit generations yet unborn. The transformation was complete, but the work would never end. As long as corporations treated the earth as commodity rather than sacred trust, as long as indigenous peoples struggled for recognition of their sovereignty and rights, there would be need for bridges between worlds, for legal advocates who understood both traditional wisdom and modern political realities. Emily smiled as she heard footsteps approaching through the outer chamber, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. New opportunities to use the gifts she had been given in service of justice and healing for the natural world. The emeralds had served their purpose, but the spirit they represented would continue to inspire those who chose community over individual advancement, hope over despair, and courage over comfort. The girl who had been chained for saying no was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned that true freedom came not from rejecting all connections, but from choosing which bonds were worth accepting. In the green firelight of the sacred chamber, surrounded by stones that held the dreams of the ancestors and the hopes of generations yet unborn, Emily knew she had finally found her way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.